Good morning and welcome to Protocol's event on the first 100 days of the Biden administration, and specifically where tech companies might land within that agenda. We launched Protocol a year ago with the thesis that tech is a power center and that the intersection of tech, policy, and politics are inextricably linked, more than tech and business leaders believe, imagine, or sometimes admit. And the implications for tech companies of all sizes, not simply big tech, are deep. If you didn't believe in our mission before the last several weeks in our nation's history, it has certainly been crystallized now. Our goal is to cover the evolution of this tech power center in an unbiased, actionable, and influential way. That is Protocol. We hope that you, as a tech business or policy leader, will continue to make Protocol your daily read and gut check. Whether it is our deep dive tech policy coverage like today's event, or our newly launched coverage verticals in enterprise tech, fintech, and Chinese technology companies, I hope we continue to be your executive companion in 2021. Today, we have a really important conversation on what the new Biden administration will mean for tech and tech-enabled companies in all industries. We start in conversation with our partner, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, and its president, Suzanne Clark. At the U.S. Chamber, Suzanne focuses on strategy, government relations, and market innovation, working in support of its more than 3 million member companies internationally, including its tech members. She leads a wide range of policy and operational initiatives at the $250 million organization. Welcome, Suzanne. We're so glad you're here with us.
Thank you so much, Tammy, and congratulations on Protocol's first anniversary.
Thank you. Yes, we are coming up on it. I'm very excited that you're here with us. Let's dive in here for a few minutes on where the Chamber is in this conversation. I know that last week you just had your big event on the state of American business, and that you and the Chamber represent the important role of the private sector in all industries. From our perch today, technology companies make up close to 30% of the S&P 500, with the 5 largest tech companies, as you know, making up over 17%. The IPO market in 2020 was heavy tech, and certainly the lineup in 2021 looks to be the same. As we come into the new year and the new administration, where is your and the Chamber's agenda in supporting business operating environment, and specifically for tech?
Well, thanks for the question, Tammy. And you're right. We have a unique vantage point at the Chamber because we have so many small businesses and 80% of the Fortune 1000, but also 117 AmChams abroad and thousands of state and local chambers and nearly 1,000 industry vertical trade associations. And so it lets us represent the whole ecosystem, of which, of course, tech plays such an important role. So when we look at this coming year, first and foremost, we're worried about the economic recovery. That means pandemic relief. That means organizing behind an infrastructure bill, an immigration bill. We need to get back to health and back to good economic health. As we look at technology and the technology sector in particular, thank God for all you all, right? I don't know how any of us would have school or work or human connections in this past terrible year without such a vibrant tech sector. And I think that America then owes it to kind of, as we've been calling our technology agenda, kind of doing America's next tech upgrade, right? And we know what some of those things mean. We know that it means workforce training, upskilling. We know it means immigration. We know it means more broadband access. But I think it also means looking at more traditional Chamber agenda items like transportation and thinking about transportation of the future, making sure we're incorporating autonomous vehicles, drones, AI, as we think about more traditional issues. So when we look at the tech agenda for this year, yes, we have workforce immigration, broadband, some of the more traditional issues. We're also trying to figure out for our more non-traditional tech issues, the tech angle, and then underlying all of it, probably one of our top priorities is a national data strategy.
You talked a little bit about infrastructure and immigration before we jump onto the regulatory piece. How do you look at immigration in terms of, that conversation is key to technology right now and to the workforce area. Can you say a little more about what the Chamber is focused on there and how you think that will impact tech?
Sure, absolutely. I think before the pandemic, when I traveled around the country, no matter what geography, no matter what industry, no matter what size company, the number one issue I heard about was workforce. Either not having the right skilled workforce, not having the right number, whatever the issue was, workforce came up first and foremost. So if I said to a job creator, what keeps you from creating the next 10 jobs, next job, next 100 jobs, it was always a workforce issue. And Tammy, it's not like the pandemic made that better. And so I think from all angles, whether it's the H-1B issues and the highly skilled workers, whether it's training the people that are already here, but increasing both the border security and taking care of those issues so that we can increase legal immigration are really key important issues for the chamber.
Absolutely. We can't talk about the tech industry without tackling some of the key policy and regulatory issues that are likely to come up in the Biden administration. Our next panel will go deep on many of them, but I'm wondering how the chamber and its members view current debates specifically around top issues like antitrust, privacy, and Section 230.
Look, I think this is the benefit of the chamber. When we go to tell stories to government, when we go to talk, and we have wide and deep relationships at the state, local, and national and global levels, when we tell these stories, we talk about how important this ecosystem is, so that we talk about these issues not about one company or one industry, but how the whole ecosystem is fragile and really hangs together. So, you asked about antitrust. If you look at antitrust, we've had a 100-year-old standard we've been well served by, right? That balances combating monopolies with increasing and invigorating innovation. And so as long as that's based on economics and the consumer welfare standard, then that rule has well served this country. Starting to use that rule for other purposes, you would have a chamber fight on your hands, I would say. We don't get involved in individual antitrust cases, but how this rule is written and how it is used and how we make sure it's not misinterpreted and misused for the wrong purposes will be an important part of our agenda. Let's see, you asked, what else did you ask about? Section 230?
Yeah, Section 230 and privacy. I'm interested in where the chamber might be.
Yeah, of course. I think if you go to Section 230, what we would say is we are having this national debate about what it means for Twitter or for Facebook or for big platforms, but we're missing the point of what it means to us as individuals when we want to say something about a restaurant we didn't like or did like, or whatever that looks like. And I'm afraid that the national debate that's happening is missing broader ramifications of the importance of this rule. So could you get us behind updating it? Maybe. But we would really be worried about any effort to throw it out. And then quickly, you asked about privacy. And it's a really complicated issue. I was just looking at some polling we did this morning. At the end of the day, the public does not support more government legalese. The public scrolls and accepts very quickly to get to the internet services that it wants. And so how we continue to protect consumers while balancing innovation is really important. And holding companies to a standard that individuals aren't interested in is a really complicated place to put companies. What our number one priority is on privacy is that we need a national standard. It's too hard in this lack of uniformity for companies to pay attention to how many rules and how many places. So watch for us. We have come out with some ideas of what that could look like, and we will continue to try to unify the business community in that corner.
Perfect. Thank you for sharing. One last question before we turn it over to our panel. That changes gears and looks more internationally for a second. The role of global trade, particularly with China and Europe, to the privacy issue that you talked about, is a key issue for tech companies and our readers. It impacts everything from innovation to privacy, supply chains, particularly in the last year. What are the key areas that you think tech executives, your members, need to be thinking about on the global trade conversation now?
Well, that, of course, is not a 2-minute answer, and I know you want a 2-minute answer, so I'll try to be fast. I think, Tammy, look, we have more than 70 people who work full-time in international, and it's because the global trading environment is so important, and it's important to small companies and big companies in every sector, and you know that as well as we do. I think we worry about efforts post-pandemic to overprotect supply chains when in fact that could be quite limiting to our ability to have diverse supply chains to react quickly to things like this pandemic. So watch for the chamber to fight against a lot of kind of Buy America provisions that we think actually do more harm than good. I think to your specific question about Europe and China, we do a lot of work in those markets, as you might imagine. And as it relates to these issues in particular, these kind of techno-nationalist policies that you see on both sides, they're different, right? You have Europe on one hand that kind of laments they don't have the big tech titans. On the other hand, they are exporting huge amounts of digital services, right? They're a huge player in that market. So we keep trying to encourage the EU to think about offense, not defense. Anything that they're doing that looks like a single market might box US and other countries out, but it certainly also boxes them in. And so their concept of being the global tech regulator is a real risk for them in terms of stifling innovation. China, on the other hand, of course, does have some big tech titans, and they can take advantage of a big domestic market. But as you know, the global market is wary of, kind of this social credit concept and the watchful eye that the Chinese keep on their companies. And so one thing that we keep talking about is we've never seen a tech company or tech sector thrive when it's cut off from the rest of the world. So watch for the chamber to continue to bolster these relationships, to increase global trade, at the same time to think about how we partner with our friends in the EU in combating some of the anti-competitiveness issues we see out of China.
Perfect. Suzanne, thanks again for joining us this morning. Thanks to the Chamber of Commerce for your partnership. I now want to welcome my colleagues, Protocol colleagues, Senior Reporter Izzy Lepowski and Reporter Emily Birnbaum, who have a great conversation ahead on these same topics on tech policy and regulation.
Thanks again, Tammy.
Thanks.
I'm Izzy Lepowski, and I am a senior reporter for Protocol, and I am joined by my colleague, Emily Birnbaum. We are obviously meeting this week at a historic time for the country, and in particular, a historic time for the tech industry, a time of a lot of change. And I think the panel we have is going to really help walk us through what tech and tech policy are going to look like over the course of the next 100 days and the next 4 years. Our guests today are FTC Commissioner Becca Slaughter, Colorado Attorney General Phil Weiser, who is leading a multi-state antitrust lawsuit against Google, Nicole Turner-Lee, who is Director of Brookings Center for Center for Tech and Data Innovation, and Jen Palka, who is former Deputy Chief Technology Officer of the United States.
So just a reminder that we'll be taking questions from everyone watching on Twitter. So you can just tweet your question with the hashtag protocol policy. So keep the questions coming in throughout. We'll try to get to some of them. So let's bring on the panel.
Great. Looks like everybody's here. Hi, everybody. Commissioner Slaughter, I want to start with you. So it's undisputable that in the last few weeks since the Capitol riot, we have seen tech giants from Facebook to Amazon taking more action on dangerous speech on their platforms than ever before. And you have Democrats on one side who are blaming these platforms for letting things get so out of hand. And you have Republicans on the other hand saying, they're blaming the platforms for muzzling the current president. And everybody in between is talking about regulation, but obviously any government regulation having to do with speech is a really dicey area. So what do you anticipate the Biden administration's approach will be to this issue, and what are the appropriate legislative and regulatory remedies here?
Thanks so much for having me. It's really a pleasure to be here, and particularly to be here with such distinguished fellow panelists. I'm really pleased to be a part of this event. So I can't speak to the president-elect, almost president's plans. But I do think what we are seeing is, on the one hand, eminently appropriate action being taken by companies to stop violence. I am concerned as a citizen that action came too late and that it might have been much better taken much earlier. But at the same time, we're seeing really important questions surface about the fact that those decisions are lying in the hands of private companies with enormous market power. So the decisions can be correct, while at the same time we can take a step back and say, what does this tell us about the states of our markets, that these really important conversations and decisions are governed entirely by individual companies with enormous market share?
So what are some ways that you think the FTC in particular can respond to this awareness?
Well, within our mandate is antitrust law. So one thing that I found really interesting is that a lot of the voices that are decrying the actions of the platforms to remove some of this dangerous content are the same ones who resist government antitrust intervention. So I think that we have to be mindful of the fact that we have laws in place and we need to be vigorously enforcing those laws that address outsized market share. The FTC has at least one big lawsuit pending on this topic. Attorney General Weiser is leading another one. And we will continue to do investigations and bring cases that address misuse of market power under our antitrust laws.
Right. And you mentioned the one big case. So this is a case the FTC has brought against Facebook. And I wanted to, of course, talk about that because when you brought that suit and a number of states brought a similar suit, Facebook essentially responded by saying the FTC is, looking at all of these past mergers, and they are essentially setting a standard where no company that has had a merger settled in the past can be sure that that is going to be permanent, and that creates instability for the companies. It creates instability for the markets. So what is your response to that criticism from Facebook?
Yeah, I think it's a little bit, I don't find it particularly persuasive that we have brought one lawsuit that seeks to address two among many mergers that happened as part of a ongoing course of conduct does not suggest that all mergers in all industries by all companies are forever in legal uncertainty. I mean, that is beyond a stretch. And what we have to do as enforcers, and what we do in this case, is look at the particular facts at issue and the particular conduct at issue. And it is the case under the law that when the FTC or the DOJ review mergers in advance, we don't clear mergers. We don't approve mergers in advance. When we get HSR filings, what we have an opportunity to do is to say, at this moment, are we going to take effort to block the merger? And in fact, in the occasions where we do those investigations and decline to take effort, we don't say, now we will never take effort, and now we will never take action. We say, right now, we're not going to take action, but that does not mean if we later understand this conduct to have been illegal, we are precluded from bringing a suit. And so what that should be is disincentives to companies to entering into conduct, whether it's mergers or other conduct that is illegal. That's what we want to disincentivize. And the threat of future lawsuits is an important part of that incentive structure.
Right. And so beyond this Facebook suit, we're looking at the next 100 days and the next 4 years. What do you think the priorities of this FTC over the next 4 years ought to be? And are there any big mistakes of the last 4 years that you think need to be corrected?
Well, I can tell you what my priorities are, and I should have said at the beginning that I'm speaking for myself as an individual commissioner, and I'm excited to serve as part of a Democratic majority. I think there's a lot of unity on the Democratic side and a lot of consensus about the direction that we need to go. From my perspective, that includes a few things. First, I think we do need to be thinking like everyone across the government is right now about pandemic response. COVID touches on a lot of areas of FTC's enforcement mandate, some obvious ones like work we've done to stop scams and phony cures, but some that are less obvious, including thinking about the effects of market concentration on, for example, supply chain resiliency. I think we need to be thinking about how all of our lives have moved digitally and the implications that has for privacy and data issues. And so prioritizing pandemic response is really important. The second thing I would say is a huge priority for me has been making sure that our enforcement efforts continue and sharpen in the efforts of our sort of long and arduous and very large national task of being anti-racist. So I want us to be centering our enforcement efforts on marginalized communities, focusing on cases where harm disproportionately falls on people of color, whether that is as workers or as consumers, So I think that kind of work is really important, and again, cuts across our mission area. And the third, more generally, I think we need to focus on being really strategic with the resources that we have. That means bringing cases that have big effect and can create deterrence across markets rather than counting how many cases we bring or how many dollars we get. I want us to think very carefully about how each federal dollar we spend can best effectuate deterrence, so we don't have to spend more federal dollars bringing the same sort of cases. And to that end, to the extent that I think there are things we could have done better over the last 4 years, there are a number of cases where I had dissented because I thought that our resolutions, while they were good enforcement resolutions, didn't go far enough on that deterrence front. And I'm concerned that we're going to end up back at the table with the same companies with the same problems if we are not bringing cases and really fighting for the outcome that will best protect consumers from having the same problem again.
Right. I want to go back to what you said about the anti-racism work, because I'm not sure that is going to be clear to everybody in our audience. Can you give us an example of a type of case that might be within the FTC's jurisdiction that might touch on that theme?
Sure. So there are a number of cases. We brought a really important case under the Equal Credit Opportunity Act last year involving auto financing, for violations of fair lending rules around auto financing and discriminatory behavior in auto financing. That's one kind of case. This is something we're very comfortable talking about in the consumer protection sphere. We are less comfortable talking about it as a general matter in the antitrust space. But for me, antitrust enforcement is fundamentally about market structure and making sure markets are fair. And one thing we know statistically is that our markets are currently structured in a way that is unfair and unequal for communities of color. And so when we make decisions to do enforcement in certain places or not do enforcement in certain places, those decisions are never neutral. They will either help make our society less unequal, or they will reinforce existing inequality. And so the first step for us, from my perspective, is just opening our eyes and understanding the effects of those decisions better, and being aware that when we choose to bring a case, let's say, for example, a hospital enforcement case is a great example. Healthcare is an area we know there are huge disparities in access and in outcomes across races. When we are bringing healthcare enforcement cases that improve access, improve quality of care, and reduce costs, particularly when the populations being served are communities of color, that's a big thing that we can do, and we already do, to help make our markets more anti-racist. And I think we just don't do that consciously or vocally. And I would rather that we be honest and transparent about the effect our actions have, and think about those decisions seriously, because we don't have the resources or the capacity to enforce all the violations of the law in all the markets. When we set priorities, for me, the priority has to include helping historically disadvantaged and marginalized communities where we need to equalize our society more effectively.
So Attorney General Weiser, I want to pose a couple of Google specific questions to you. So obviously there are 3 big cases against Google right now, one from the DOJ, one led by Texas, and another one led by yourself and the Nebraska Attorney General. So, for our audience, what is going to happen next with these cases? And specifically, are you hoping that the Biden administration is going to broaden their case against DOJ, or that the DOJ is going to broaden their case against Google, and if so, in what ways?
Emily and Protocol, thank you for having me. It is great to be with you. This is a wonderful conversation with, as Commissioner Slaughter put it, a tremendous panel. I've known each member of this panel before and think the world of them. So it's great to be a part of this discussion. Yes, you put your finger on it. We filed a case that is broader than the Department of Justice's case. We very much would like to see the Department of Justice broaden their case. We took our time to make that case. They filed their case earlier, and I think that explains a lot of the difference. We believe that the breadth of Google's anti-competitive conduct needs to be examined in its totality, and the additional areas we focused on. For example, we talked about the impact on connected cars as a new platform of the future, where Google's anti-competitive conduct hurts consumers, limits choice, and hurts innovation, we think the DOJ should embrace that theory and some others that we added. As for the Texas case, it's actually in a different jurisdiction, and whether it stays there or not is going to play out over time. I'm not a part of that case, so I won't be a part of influencing it at this point. I do recognize that when you have a company as big as Google, it's quite possible that you have a series of different types of anti-competitive actions, and that ultimately the challenge for our judicial system will be to get to a remedy that restores competition in a way that's forward-looking and that gives consumers choices and that enables innovation in this critical sector.
So 2 questions. One, you mentioned the Texas case. Have there been any conversations about Colorado or any other states in your coalition joining on with the Texas case?
So we continue to monitor the relevant developments and decide how they relate and how individual states will position themselves. There are a range of considerations, including workload. In some cases, different times you have different states putting energy in different directions. So we're going to keep a close eye. We definitely recognize the need for coordination in these cases. And at this point, we're focusing on the one that we have, and then we'll see where things go in the future.
Okay, and then the second question is, President-elect Biden has announced that Merrick Garland is going to be his attorney general. Some people in the antitrust world were very excited about that because he does technically have some antitrust background. Have you engaged in any preliminary conversations with the incoming attorney general or anyone on his team about the Google case?
So I'm not one to talk about conversations that happen or don't happen with either the current or the incoming administration. So instead, I will say your note about excitement is appropriate. I had the chance to serve with Judge Garland in the Clinton administration, where he was known and appreciated for his interest in antitrust law. He has written on this topic, not just as a judge, but even before becoming a judge. So he has an interest in antitrust law. And I do believe, getting back to what Commissioner Slaughter was saying, is antitrust law at this moment is poised to play a very important role in our economy, because both the issues around fairness, around opportunities, around protecting consumers at a time of great concentration, these issues are breaking through. So this is a national priority, and the House of Representatives had a substantial report focusing on these issues. This is something that we really need to recognize. It's not just sort of an arcane legal in the weeds issue. It's a important economic policy issue.
And I wanted to ask you a little bit. Obviously, you were a part of antitrust enforcement during the Obama administration. Many critics say that Obama didn't do enough to rein in monopoly power, especially in the tech sector. And now, we're facing the concentrated industry that we see today. In your opinion, what should a Biden administration do when it comes to antitrust enforcement that Obama did not? And, what do you anticipate we'll see from a Biden administration when it comes to antitrust enforcement?
There are some lessons that can be learned over the last decade. And one of the challenges we have, you hear this a lot, hindsight's 2020. Should the investigation of Google around a decade ago gone differently? That investigation was happening just as the transition to mobile was going on. With the benefit of hindsight, we see how Google used a range of anti-competitive tactics, notably the exclusive distribution arrangements with Apple and other entities, to control the mobile space and to become the search provider of choice in mobile in ways that were not just competing on the merits, but involved predatory and anti-competitive actions. We now do not want to allow that to happen for these next generation platforms like the connected cars example I mentioned. So we are acting both looking at what happened in the past, but also with an awareness of what goes forward. As for another lesson from the Obama antitrust, it's not quite tech, but I do think it's important. There were too many mergers allowed in some sectors. Airlines is the most obvious. And we saw this because fuel prices went down, but consumers didn't get the benefits. The New York Times had a good article writing about this. Literally, consumers got free peanuts. The companies made record profits. And that is a telltale sign that concentration wasn't really about efficiency, wasn't about consumer benefits. It was about helping those concentrated entities to make more money. And we see this in other sectors too. We did a report, for example, in pharmaceuticals, where a lot of concentration is allowed, what looks to be coordination, which could be implicit between the sellers, so that prices for insulin have been rising well above inflation. We've also brought a case against generic pharmaceuticals for price fixing, raising healthcare prices. So we know that consumers are hurt when we have concentration, when we have collusion, when we have monopolistic activity. I think the lesson right now is we need to lean in and recognize antitrust enforcement plays a critical role and look for where the right opportunities are. And these two cases we've talked about, Facebook and Google, are both monopolization cases, but there are a range of other cases, merger cases, collusion cases. We need an active antitrust agenda, and I think that's the big lesson going into a Biden administration.
We got one question for you, Attorney General, from Twitter. Do you have any thoughts on the Google Fitbit deal, given the Colorado, Nebraska focus on emerging tech?
So I tend to be less open probably than certainly commentators like Nicole or Jen, who can say what they're thinking on this, in that I'm now investigating these issues. So I can't actually share my thoughts on this. I do want to underscore we're going to continue to be vigilant, looking at all relevant factors, knowing that we've got a trial date set for 2023. Events will happen between now and then. It's going to be a challenge on us to make sure to take count of those events and make sure that our ultimate remedy can restore competition and a vibrant marketplace that benefits consumers.
Got it. And one last question for you. There's a lot of anxiety right now about whether President-elect Biden will choose antitrust enforcers that have corporate ties, including to big tech. And so I'm wondering if you think how the new administration should handle conflicts of interest. Do you think, what is the ethical framework you think should be put in place there?
The Antitrust Division, where I served twice, has a very well-developed set of ethical rules. Obviously, if you worked on a particular matter, you can't work on it. You work for a client, there's a period before you could be ever allowed to do anything on that client. There's a range of these protections. Whether or not you go above and beyond those protections is a important question. I would note something that Joseph Kennedy was reportedly said to have been picked by FDR, which is sometimes someone with experience, and Jen can probably speak to this. So there are people who might have worked in Silicon Valley and become disillusioned with what they saw. Those people could have a lot of knowledge about the relevant conduct. And so I would just encourage people, don't paint with too broad a brush. There are people out there who might have worked at Google, at Facebook, at other big tech companies, or even lawyers. And that in and of itself, I would say, isn't necessarily disqualifying. I would look at the whole of a person's record, a whole of a person's experience, attitudes, and approach. The importance that we need right now is someone with an enforcement mindset. It is easy to talk yourself out of bringing cases. When I worked for Joel Klein, he was committed to getting to the bottom of the Microsoft case and to be able to bring a case. And there are lots of reasons he could have been talked out of it, but he saw his way forward, and that is an historic precedent. The same was true about Bill Baxter, who was litigating the AT&T case during a Reagan administration. So there are a range of potential leaders that could come from lots of different places. My commitment is to work with whoever gets chosen, and my advice is pick someone with an enforcement mindset, because if you go into the job looking not to bring cases, you'll find reasons not to bring cases. You need to be really smart and rigorous about it. We have to win in court. And part of the challenge we have is some of the court decisions, I think about the FTC's recent Qualcomm decision, have really been horrendous. And that's why you're seeing Congress actually getting into a discussion about whether courts are unduly setting standards that make it hard for enforcers to win. So there's a lot of work to do. I look forward to doing that work with whoever gets chosen.
Well, thank you for setting me up perfectly to ask Jen about relations between Washington and tech. They've obviously frayed since the Obama years, which is when you were working in the White House. Back then, these companies and the people who ran them were sort of the darlings of the economy. And now we see tech companies openly protesting their bosses over working with the U.S. government, especially particular contracts with the Defense Department. And you have basically dedicated most of your work life this last decade on getting tech and government to work together. So how does the Biden administration work to repair that relationship? And do you think it is important that they repair that relationship?
Yeah, thank you. And again, thank you for having me here. It is such an amazing panel. It's really an honor. And I will start, I think, by echoing A.G. Weiser's comments. I think sometimes we're in a position where those in tech are the most critical of tech and in fact are coming out of tech and know the technology very well. And so they can sometimes be uniquely useful in crafting arguments to explain where we need to go to make tech more fair, more equitable, shape our economy in the ways that we want to go. Yes, the Biden administration, I think, is in a fantastic position to build relationships. I think the distinction that we need to make is between the tech companies and the people of tech. In terms of government using the tech companies as a supplier, we have not made progress, but I think it's also debatable what progress is. In the years of the Trump administration, the connection between the tech companies and government as it relates to technologies that they may adopt to make, say, service delivery more effective, more efficient, treat people with greater respect. That's all really taken a backseat to all of the other issues that the two previous speakers spoke to, right? It's complicated, the adoption of technology, and yes, the outrage by people who work at tech companies about some of the practices of their bosses and the leadership at those companies has made it very difficult for them to engage. So I don't really see that we've gone anywhere since, say, the Project Maven thing, where Google did pull out of a defense contract. There was a report that came out, I think a couple days ago, from the Defense Department saying that, in fact, they're having significant fragility in their supply chain because they really only have one or two suppliers for lots of things. Now, Google's not going to be, or any of the other tech companies, is not going to be the right supplier for most of those things. But we do have a very significant deficit, both on the defense side and the civilian side and service delivery, both at the feds and at the state level, in our ability to do software well. And I do think we need to work on that. But perhaps what the Biden administration can do best is build on the it's not entirely new, but the enthusiasm that many people from tech have today to do public service. So I helped start the United States Digital Service 6 years ago in the Obama White House. It has survived actually very well under the administration that is now departing. In fact, they've done some really incredible work. They announced just this morning that they are working on cross-government hiring. So it's not just tech hiring, how to great tech people into government, but they've been working for the past year and a half with the Office of Personnel Management on the fact that 90% of jobs that are put out by the federal government under competitive, open to the public process use only self-attestation to know if you are qualified, which means I could say, and let me be clear, I have zero tech or design skills, but I'm an absolute expert in Python programming and internet security and web design. And as long as I say those things, and especially if I check some other boxes, I will go on the cert list for this. So USDS, a technology group, has been working on that in a way and coming out with this great report this morning on how they're going to fix that in a way that's going to surprise everybody. And it's going to make, I think, not only the rest of government really stand up and take notice and say, what is this tech group doing working on such foundational issues that can make our government better? But I think it's always also really exciting for all those people who've been sitting on the sidelines for 4 years going, our country is falling apart. And I'm over here, making the response times for some commercial website, 0.101% faster. I want to serve. I want to help fix our country. We're really in a really great position, not just to sort of figure out what's going on with the tech companies, but to say to tech talent in this world, in this country, come in, you can do the most impactful work of your life. You can do it with public sector values. You can do it with a racial equity lens, as Commissioner Slaughter talked about. The new funding that's coming to both the United States Digital Service and 18F and the Technology Transformation Service within the General Services Administration is going to allow for an enormous amount of hiring to take advantage of that incredible desire to serve the public from the tech industry.
Yeah, I was going to ask about that because as part of the Biden COVID relief plan, we saw $9 billion a year going to the Technology Modernization Fund and other funding, as you mentioned, to USDS and Tech Transformation Services. So walk us through what you hope that funding goes toward hiring, and then what else?
I actually hope it mostly goes towards hiring.
Okay.
I think that we've been in an era where government has essentially said technology is not a core capability, digital is not a core capability, design of our services is not a core capability. We will always be outsourcing those things. I'm not suggesting we pull it back in, but if we treat it as a core capability and we have enough people who know what good looks like, we can do a much, much better job of procuring technology that works for the American people. Certainly, there's going to be a big focus on cybersecurity. That's understandable. But I think what these two organizations bring to the table is a realization that it's not just sort of the checklist style cybersecurity that has frankly failed us, but that it's the awareness of how software is built to be secure from the start, and the understanding that cybersecurity, we have failed essentially because cybersecurity is like, here's a checklist. It was developed 10 years ago. It's a great checklist. I've nothing, it's exactly the set of things that one would do at a particular moment in time. But people have no time or energy to use, or sometimes they don't have the skills to actually use their expertise to truly secure the platform that they're talking about. You need people inside who really understand how software is built in order to make our systems more secure. I'll also say there's this sort of compliance kind of security that we have seen. There's also the security of like how both national and state-driven technology is built. That's like, is it a security issue that we have enormous amounts of fraud, for instance, in unemployment insurance?
Right.
It's the way that it's built. And when we can get more tech talent in at all those levels, and of course, increasing the connectivity between the federal and state level as it relates to technology, we're going to be able to build these things so that they work for people. And we're not just fighting the fraud, we're actually delivering unemployment insurance benefits to the people who need them. And I will also echo, again, the comments on the racial equity lens here, because the way we are delivering unemployment insurance benefits right now has a terrible, terrible, disproportionate impact, negative impact on Black and brown people.
That's a really good point. And Nicole, I wanted to bring you in last but not least. We have a question from Twitter. They're asking, how do you think we can bridge the digital divide in rural America and provide access to broadband for millions of Americans? And I was going to ask you this question anyway before we saw it on Twitter, because like Jen was saying, one of the most obvious inequities we've seen is this digital divide for school children in the COVID era. So I would love to hear your thoughts on what specific steps the Biden administration needs to take immediately to close that digital divide, as long as students are going to continue to be out of school.
No, thank you. And thank you to Protocol for having me, to Issy and Emily, to the AG, who I've known for a very long time, as well as the commissioner who has sat on the stage at Brookings. Before I answer that question, let me just say this, something that the commissioner said, as well as the AG said, that I think really should resonate with people as we go into this first 100 days. And everyone has said it, and I cannot tell you just how excited I am by the fact that the two words racial equity have been used in this conversation more than once. And that's something I don't think that we have said in a way that figuratively will impact policy. So I'm really excited. And Commissioner, I'm sitting here with my wheels turning in terms of an anti-racist framework to antitrust policy, because as you know, they've not gone together. Historically, we've never talked about them in the same breath. And I think the same thing with what the AG has said, looking at the evolving nature of tech is actually going to make this tricky, because even when that lawsuit was actually filed, we have seen such evolution in tech that I think at the end of the day, it's really going to be upon this new administration to pay attention. When we get to the digital divide, I mean, I think perhaps soon to be President Biden and Vice President Harris have really laid out in the Build Back Better framework this idea of how to close the rural divide. I mean, obviously, there's going to be about $20 billion invested in this, which we know is really not going to be enough because we need an all hands on deck, all hands on funding strategy to actually close all the divides across America. We know that there's actually going to be a pushback towards municipal broadband, which may not be a bad idea given the fact that we have all these Post-it notes on the wall, but yet we haven't come up with one frame. And so giving responsibility back to localities to actually do what they have to do to get the smallest of communities connected may not be a bad idea. And then I think the focus on universal service, particularly Lifeline, as well as some other infrastructure projects will actually help with rural access. But let me put this out here. In this stage of broadband, just as we've evolved for the last 20, 25 years, it's not an either or scenario at this point. As it's been mentioned, we are relying more and more on tech to live, to shop, to go to our doctors, to get online for schools. Some of these behaviors are not going to go away. And I think it's important that we not just recognize the market failures, but we have to go back to adoption and use. Where are we going to look at how tech is positioned to ensure that we have not just enough infrastructure, but we're also investing in the adoption and utilization of the resources? That is going to be a challenge, and I'm very excited that this administration is looking at taking on the Digital Equity Act. But all of these pieces are just one part of the equation. Want to go back to something I just wrote for Brookings around a tech new deal. We're now looking at the fact that I think the chamber leader said this, that it's not just about tech for certain functions, it's about tech for all of reality. Not just in terms of getting kids back online, but the ability to actually have an environment where people are being trained on how to build infrastructure, being trained on how to use technology. My 14-year-old daughter really does not like virtual school, but guess what? She's learning how to work in disaggregated work environments, how to be remote, how to develop different organizational skills. With 100,000 businesses permanently closed as a result of this pandemic, we are going to be trusting tech to be the new economic driver. And I think it's really important that we position it that way. For those of us that have been working on digital divide issues where it was very binary, who's online, who's not, who has a device, who doesn't, we're beyond that. The train has left the station. We start talking about, consumer protection. What happens to people who do not have financial collateral? They can't get a ride sharing service. They can't get a hotel. There's going to be things that they cannot do if you don't have a device. You can't even get quality healthcare, or better yet, sign up for your vaccination. So all these things I think are big part of the big plan, the new deal that we need this administration to integrate into every aspect of their thought in the next 100 days. I would also suggest to this administration, it's not just a rural problem. We have urban issues too when it comes to connectivity, whether it's competition, the quality of service, where people live within a certain urban community. We know if you're not in the tourist center and you live on the outside of the census tract or the wrong side of the railroad track, you're not getting access. And so we really need to think about how broadband is an American problem, and it's not just something that we should be just feeding onto rural. And I would also say on rural, as a matter of fact, and I love this about the administration, again, I'm gonna keep writing down racial equity. Rural communities are not just white communities, right? They're Native American, they're Latino, they're African American. So my hope is whatever we do, keep pushing the envelope, because at the end of the day, as the commissioner said it, we are now in pandemic response mode, but we're also in the fight for our life in the United States. And that fight for our life is not just going to involve the technology that we see, but in a technology frame, it's also going to involve the emerging technologies that without a federal privacy standard, without an intention to algorithmic bias and other deceptive practices, we actually run the risk of going backwards. So I want to put that out there to that person who actually put that out there. Now, in terms of schools, it's so interesting because I think we're going to see something really, I just spoke to over the weekend some superintendents. We're going to see this propensity to put money towards the safety of our children, which I think is rightfully so. We're going to want to actually, ramp up our ability to have social distancing in schools, the type of PPE for teachers, et cetera. But one thing that we're not going to pay too much attention to, so I'll put it out here in a protocol event, is that we go into this first 100 days ensuring that no child is left offline again. Here's what happened during this pandemic. Teachers had no idea what it was like to be a broadband champion, to come up with mesh networks and develop broadband networks for their students. They didn't even know who served their communities, which was another basic failure in terms of what we did for young children. But if we go back to trying to fit everything back into the four walls of a school building, guess what's going to happen? Recently, I had a superintendent from California who's not dealing with a pandemic, but she's dealing with wildfires. So she's had the same type of reaction to trying to make sure that kids stay connected to learning. When we talk about Black kids who stay disconnected from learning in the next few months, they will regress in terms of educational achievement by 7 to 8 months, according to a study by McKinsey. Latino students will be 7 months, low-income students will be almost a year. So we have to find ways until we have a national vaccination strategy to do what my dear friend at the FCC, Jessica Rosenwasser, said, close this homework gap, but most importantly, keep our kids online. Let's not go into this putting all of the money into just the protective measures, but let's figure out for all of those schools that had to reshovel CARES Act money, had to wait for the next stimulus, how do we actually make this sustainable so that every child walks in with a tablet and a textbook, a Wi-Fi hotspot, and a pencil? Because that's the new wave of, I think, how we're going in terms of our school reopening. And I would just end with this. The same thing is going to happen for telehealth. What do we do with people like my 70-plus-year-old mother who now knows how to turn her camera the right way to actually see her doctor, who struggles with a rare disease, who doesn't want to go back to the hospital, or doesn't want to go back into a clinic on a regular basis? Will we also in the administration think about, again, the role of technology in healthcare, the role of technology in education, the role of technology, as has been said, in transportation? And so I think in this first 100 days is a big challenge. Yes, we have to solve some of the Post-it notes that we can actually see, but I think it really is incumbent on the new administration and the appointees to solve the bigger problem of advancing us in 2.0 of the digital revolution and making it fair, racially palatable for all populations, and ensure that we have the type of resiliency, safety, and security that goes along with these networks. That's my point, and I'm sticking to it.
I like no child left offline. I like that.
And we've got one more question for you about something else that you've written about. You touched on it a little bit. So algorithmic bias and sort of like, okay, how can a Biden administration actually do something about this issue, which has been articulated by so many researchers? And I just was wondering if you could run through, what are a couple of the regulatory levers that a Biden administration could pull to deal with the issue of algorithmic bias? And obviously that question applies to both you and Becca, because I think the FCC has a role here.
Yeah, no, I mean, I think on the role of algorithmic bias, this is a huge problem. And the commissioner actually pointed it out. It's an area that I think we both have. I mean, we share a lot of interest. And this is one where it just kind of scares me at night because of all the data that's been collected over the last few months. The idea that we could take that data and sort of repackage it to be deceptive and to sustain systemic inequalities against certain groups scares me. Because what we will see is that it's not necessarily the algorithm itself that is biased, but it starts with the developer's intentions, values, and assumptions about the world. It rests upon the training data that is used. You try to develop criminal justice algorithms that leverage criminal justice data. You're actually starting with a false start because the population that's going to be most represented are Black and brown populations. And then it goes into the eligibility determinations. Where does it make most sense to apply algorithms? In this case of bias, it's creeping into financial services, decisions around housing, credit, healthcare, education. And so all of these things have implications for populations to actually grow and become socially mobile in this country and the world. So I would hope, because there are dozens of congressional activities that have been happening, there's actions that I know that are at the FTC, there's conversations that are happening at the Federal Reserve. I just did a panel for them. The question becomes, will this administration sort of take stock of what's out there and determine the best place where they should be inserting policy and the type of law enforcement that needs to go behind them? And so I'm a big fan of us actually developing a multi-stakeholder process around algorithmic bias that's just not policymakers, but it consists of developers, technologists, privacy experts, legal experts, and sociologists like myself who can actually sit down and make sense of that. And I think in the United States, we've taken cues over this last administration from the international partners, but we've not necessarily come up with what I think is our own culture and norms and values around what we want to do in the States. And so the more that we have that multi-stakeholder conversation, I think it would also help us guide, and I'll say this is the last thing, what part of the box do we want to be on? Do we want to be on the input side or we want to be on the determination side? And when we decide where we think policymakers or regulators fit better, then we'll actually do a couple of things. will raise awareness among consumers as to algorithmic literacy, but we'll also find ourselves, establishing the right protocols. I would just say this. There's no reason that we couldn't start in this administration with applying every existing civil rights statute to tech, period. If you're going to design a credit analysis tool that relies upon algorithms, make sure it's compliant with the Fair Credit Act. If you're going to design a housing tool, make sure it aligns with the Fair Housing Act. To me, that's a simple start that we actually had some traction with Congress. But I do think going forward, we need more multi-stakeholder conversations, much like we had in the previous Obama administration.
And I just love to add that we just also need more people who are implementing these within government, particularly not just, not just in what the platforms are doing, but in services that, the government offers to the American people, actually understand what's going on inside that box.
On this point about multi-stakeholderism, what Nicole picked up and we did in the Obama administration, you see it in Europe too with like codes of conduct and commitment to diversity, equity, inclusion in the tech sector and in how technology is used is a good example. Government can set sort of a priority, bring people to the table, and then leverage action against those goals. And that happens on a range of fronts. Racial equity is a perfect example and one that we're really need to take action on.
And Commissioner Slaughter, where do you see the role of the FTC in all of this? And you've laid out your anti-racist framework for the future of the FTC. What is the role of the agency when it comes to mitigating algorithmic bias and facilitating some of this engagement?
Yeah, well, probably unsurprisingly, I agree with a lot of what Nicole and everyone else have said. I think we do need a multi-stakeholder process. I think the FTC is one of the interested stakeholders that should be involved. I also think we need to, in this area, as in all other areas, be critically examining the toolbox we have and thinking creatively about how we can use all the tools in it to address this issue. This is something I spoke about and wrote about a year ago on this topic. For me, algorithmic bias is an economic justice issue. We see disparate outcomes coming out of algorithmic decision-making that disproportionately affect and harm Black and Brown communities and affect their ability to participate equally in society. That's something we need to address. And we need to think about whether it fits under our unfairness framework, whether we might have rulemaking authority that could apply to it, whether we use statutes like ECOA, as I mentioned earlier, or FCRA. But I think it's one of those things where really good creative thinking needs to be applied. The issue is new and it is hard. But one thing I remind myself all the time, my older daughter, who is in Zoom school downstairs in my house right now, and like Nicole's, hates it. She was in kindergarten last year, and her teacher would say to her all the time, kindergartners can do hard things. And I say to myself, okay, well, if kindergartners can do hard things, the FTC can do hard things, government can do hard things, and we have to start trying to tackle the big problems.
If I can make one other small point, this applies to state and local government too. And the issues Nicole talked about with smart cities, surveillance, how technology is rolled out, we need this dialogue up and down the stack, if you will, engaging those who can help us address critical public policy priorities.
That's right.
Yeah, I agree with that. And I just wanted to put the final pin in it, which is the work we do is important. Who is doing the work is also important. We have a big diversity, equity, and inclusion problem in terms of who the decision makers are throughout government right now. And we need to do a better job bringing in voices from Black and Brown communities, bringing in people who are living some of the experiences we're trying to address, and making sure that all of our decision making is inclusive and participatory.
Yeah, well, and if I could say something on that, I think, one thing that I've gleaned from this that I've been trying to also put my hands around is, what does that look like? And I really think we've developed an Office of Civil Rights in the Department of Justice. I just saw something about an Office of Racial Equity in the health, the HHS. We need something like that in terms of touching upon our tech sectors, whether it's OSTP, whether it's the FCC, FTC, just a coordination of these conversations, bringing also interagency support. Because as we're finding out, it's the Department of Justice needs to be this conversation, Department of Labor. They're going to actually develop apprenticeships for Black and Brown people to get into wireless infrastructure development, that they need to be at the table too. So I think one big point, a big takeaway is creating some type of office or commission or advisory that does just that.
And I think shout out to Alondra Nelson, who will be Deputy Director at OSTP, who's going to champion that like nobody's business. So
That's
we're
right.
excited.
Can she hear us?
I had a feeling you were going to shout her out. That's great. Well, I love ending on a call to action. So that's a call to action to everybody who's watching us and to our incoming administration. So thank you all so much for joining us. We look forward to seeing how this is all going to play out over the next 100 days and the next 4 years. And I'm sure we'll have a lot more to discuss next time we meet. So until then, stay safe, everyone. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Thanks for having us.
Thank you.